If you're going to have a nuclear attack, you need surprise. Do not announce it. Do not announce because you can be preempted.
Russia's aggression against Ukraine grinds on, and Vladimir Putin is becoming increasingly isolated on the world stage. To help us better understand what's really happening right now and weave through the noise of the news cycle, I've asked George Friedman from Geopolitical Futures to join us for this week's Global Macro Update. George, it's always good to see you. Thanks for joining me. I really I'm glad you agreed to this interview this week in particular, because it's really hard sometimes to understand the significance of some of the events that we hear about in the U.S. news, particularly with what's happening in Ukraine. So I'm hoping you can give some perspective.
Well, I'll try. Essentially, the main Russian offensive failed. It failed on the first day when the tanks couldn't go, and it failed because there were not enough troops, poor training, and bad logistics. You send troops in an attack, you have to feed them. And the Russians have always had a problem with logistics. A lot of countries do. But these compounded themselves into a situation that Putin never in his life expected, that he would be on the defensive in Ukraine. And he's now at the point where he has to go from his initial expectation, which is sooner or later they're going to fold, to having to devise a new strategy.
So this week, over the last couple of weeks, Ukraine has reclaimed some of the territory that it lost. And we had an announcement that there would be an activation in Russia of approximately 300,000 troops. And that's being delivered as a big deal here in this country. That's another area where I'm not sure I have the right perspective. Is that a big deal? Is 300,000 troops being activated a significant number? Or is it basically just what he should have done to begin with?
Well, yeah, but you also have to understand what activation means. Let's say there are 300,000 troops. Only 100,000 fail in physicals. Okay, or something. We're not going to worry about physicals. Now, how many trainers do you have? How many rifle experts do you have to train them? How many people are there to condition them? Remember, these guys have been sitting around drinking vodka for a while. They got to get out there and run. They got to be able to be fit. So you're looking at a situation where it's going to take several months at best to get them into shape to operate. That means it'll be winter before they get there. And that means that it's really going to be spring, almost a year, before those troops are operational. The basic problem that they have is they don't have sergeants. Now, sergeants are somebody who are not to be loved, but feared. In other words, they don't have non-commissioned officers who you would normally train, British or Chinese or American troops. So they're going to bring in junior officers to do the training. Those guys will be about 21, have once heard a bullet fired and nothing beyond them. So the problem they have with that number is it sounds impressive, but when you start to look at it from a professional point of view, you take a look at who the trainers are, and you also remember the fact that these troops are vulnerable. They're going to be in a place, U.S. satellites will see them. We haven't hit the Russians yet, but if the Russians have to assume they're going to be hit, therefore they won't be in the same place. They'll be training dispersed. So it is one of those great announcements. Now reality sets in and it gets much more complicated.
Okay. That's the perspective I was hoping for. Another area that I think would be well to clarify is in the U.S. news cycle, we're now starting to see stories of how Russia's last czar was taken out of power by the generals and by some Russian elite. He was invited to leave. And we're also seeing interesting stories about how Putin is being treated by non-Western leaders, supposed friends, the most recent being Erdogan daring to make him wait almost a full minute for a meeting. What's in this for Putin at this point? Where is he at personally on the world stage, and what's at stake for him?
Both he and his country are in the same place. They've got to make it work now. They went into Ukraine with an expectation that this was going to be a slam dunk. The Ukrainians couldn't resist, with a massive intelligence failure concerning what the Germans are going to do, and totally misreading the American intention. They never thought the U.S. was going to pile into this that heavily. If he even negotiates at this point, his reputation in Russia is shot, because that's where you get, and if he doesn't, well, then they're going to keep fighting and having casualties. The Tsar was overthrown by the soldiers. The soldiers mutinied. Then the officers, seeing that they'd lost control over the soldiers, proceeded to take down the Tsar. Right now, there's little evidence of the Russian soldiers mutinying. The soldiers to mutiny, it has to be that they are taking a lot of hits. It's not clear that the officers know what they're doing, and they're dying for nothing. That will be where it starts. At this point, close, but not quite.
Okay. So there was a time, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, where Vladimir Putin disappeared for almost 2 weeks. Completely went off of the public stage. And there was all kinds of theories as to what was going on and where he was. One of the more interesting theories I heard was that he was being taken aside for a talking to, if you will, by those that actually run the country. But there were also theories of him having the flu, having back problems, going to see the birth of an illegitimate love child, all kinds of crazy rumors going around. You and I discussed this at the time, and you said one of the big issues here is there isn't any obvious contingency plan or plan for a post-Putin Russia. Is that still the case? And do you think that if there are some elites in Russia in a position of influence at that level, that they might be getting more concerned now?
Well, first, he may have gone on vacation for 2 weeks. People do that. Secondly, there is no succession process. There is no Politburo, as there used to be, that had the power to push Khrushchev aside or select Gorbachev or what have you. There is no process whereby you can replace him except for a coup d'etat. He basically has set that up. But at a certain point, you're going to get to the question of, is Putin okay? But it's really important not to simply look at Putin. Putin is one guy. This is a consensus in the Russian elite that was perfectly reasonable. Russia lives and dies by invasions from the West. They used to be 1,000 miles away from the West. After the fall of the Soviet Union, they were about 260 miles away by Highway 3 from Moscow. He had to do something. Problem was that if he did that and took Ukraine, he'd be directly on the border with NATO. He'd be pushing us into a new Cold War. So we have two sides that I will say had reasonable strategic goals. They completely collided. So it came down to the question of, how far is the United States going to come into this? And whereas you've got to hand it to the Ukrainian soldiers, this is American technology pounding away at the Russians, especially the artillery. It's American satellites getting intelligence. There is a story out that I believe is true, which is that the attack for the counterattack right now was vetted in the Pentagon. That the Ukrainians sent it over to the Pentagon changed some dots and everything, whatever. True or not, it's something that is plausible. So what he didn't grasp is that he was absolutely right. When he said, this is about war with the Americans, he was right, but he didn't believe it was going to be that way. And now he is facing the enormous difficulty of dealing with the Americans, especially when they're not taking casualties. The casualties are Ukrainian. The war plan is American. The American public is not getting upset about it. No body bags are coming back to Dover. And Now he's realized that he doesn't have the force to break this coalition. And he's got to do it, because if he doesn't, then the question of the future of Putin and the regime become a question. And how he does it, well, his first try is the obvious one, mobilization. And the second try is threatening nuclear weapons. But
Before we get to the nuclear weapons question, I'd like to get your thoughts on the conventional weapons side, because both sides are funneling massive amounts of conventional weapons into this arena. And I'm assuming that the U.S. has a lot more of a stockpile than Russia. But is there any way to tell if Russia's getting at a dangerously low level at this point?
The fact that they have not counterattacked effectively against the Ukrainian penetration, and that the Ukrainians have handled whatever attacks took place, indicates that the Russians are at low ebb in terms of forces. Now, for that salient, you really want to do artillery, very heavy artillery, a lot of it. The capacity of the Russians to produce not the artillery, but the shells in the amounts you need and get them to the battlefield, I talked about logistics before, is really in question. So we're sitting here, the Russians are foaming at the mouth. It's over a week since the penetration, and they haven't been able to mount an offensive from the forces that were already deployed. He has to go back and deploy more forces. This is just a massive miscalculation.
And that sort of brings us to the discussion around nuclear weapons. And George, at Geopolitical Futures, your research firm, you recently wrote two pieces, one about strategic nuclear weapons and one about tactical nuclear weapons. And they were very insightful, very informative. I think most people just lump nuclear into one basket, if you will. But you make the point that that's very much not the case. Given that tactical nuclear weapons could potentially be used without the massive amount of radiation fallout that could blow into Russia, what is the chance of them being used? I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think that's on the table? And if they were used, have they ever been used before anywhere?
They've never been used before because there are other better weapons to use. In other words, when you get a tactical weapon, that means you're dealing with small areas, an armored unit coming at you. Strategic means you're killing cities. Okay, so this does not leak that much radiation. Okay, and it has a footprint, but you can probably take out that target with artillery without the complexity of doing this. The reason it has never been used is not only the terminology is scary to people, okay, it's that in many cases you're equipped out in the field with artillery. The artillery may be 2-3 rounds more than on a tactical level. The artillery will work, is useful. There's no reason to go to it. And the second thing is, if you're going to have a nuclear attack, you need surprise. Do not announce it. Do not announce, because you can be preempted. Because it's very dangerous to scare the Americans, and the Russians know that. So the fact that he's announcing an unknown nuclear strike, I haven't said this is tactical, he could be strategic. Well, the one thing you don't want to do is bring America to full alert, because at full alert, you want every second you can have to take out missile sites without them firing. I promise you that if the guys are sitting around drinking beer, they aren't now. That the U.S. system is on full alert. And even if they don't fire the United States, they might do it. So my read of it is that if he were serious, one day a mushroom cloud would appear somewhere. If he's going to keep announcing that he's going nuclear, he's just alerted the U.S. to a very high rate of readiness. And the response is unpredictable for him. So I don't read him as serious about this. If a serious actor would not do what he's doing, he's trying to shape the war into something very dangerous, because then he can negotiate and appear to be negotiating with strength. He knows he's got to talk his way out of this. And he's got to have some way to scare people. Nuclear weapons are always scary. People don't really look at them. And he's giving away the one thing he has to have: time. He has to have those extra 20 seconds to get to that strike before anything comes at you.
So do you think that Putin's goals or expectations for this conflict have changed? You think he's going to settle for something far less than all of Ukraine? Do you think he would settle for what he's got now, and if he could, if he were even allowed to, and say that he made a point and walk off claiming victory? Where are we in the time frame?
He's got to do something that makes him more dangerous. He's got to motivate, particularly the Americans, to want to end this. And as I said before, we're not taking casualties, we're using weapons, we're having a fine old time. He has really this option, which is flanking the Ukrainians, not engaging them, but either going to the north or the south. Belarus, which is to the north, and a Russian ally, said something about army officers being mobilized. They've got a substantial army. There's activity down in Serbia around President Dodik, getting very close. All this is intended to get us nervous. But at the same time, he's got to come at the Ukrainians in a different way. He's got to inflict some casualties on the Americans. He's got to do something. And then talk. Okay? So what he would like to do, and I think he'll fail, is come in from the flanks, engage the Ukrainians, inflict casualties, force them into a retreat, take more of the country. The other thing he did was he announced that he was going to have a referendum in the occupied areas that he has. Well, those are areas he owned before. This is Russian occupied area. Before the war began, there was pro-Russian and there were a lot of Russian forces. And everybody's always said that the settlement is going to be officially giving this area to the Russians, Ukraine getting the rest. That was what he rejected. So it's very interesting that he spoke about making this area Russian because it kind of confirms what the war began with and turn it into victory.
George, there's nobody better than you at giving perspective on this, and that's why I wanted to speak with you this week. Is there any parting thoughts on the conflict and the stage that it's at before we end this?
We have to remember that if the Soviet Union fragments, it becomes highly unpredictable and dangerous. It's got nuclear weapons. Right now it's under control. I think we have to be very careful not to win too big, because there are then consequences. Putin appears crazy, but he's not. He's a smart calculator. I don't know who follows him if he falls. I'm probably the only guy in the United States who thinks we can talk to this guy. We just have to slap him around a little. Don't slap him so hard that he's unconscious.
George Friedman from Geopolitical Futures, as always, thank you for your amazing insights. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. You take care.
Thanks for watching Global Macro Update from Malden Economics. And just a quick note, after we hung up from that interview, George and I had a laugh because he realized that he said, if the Soviet Union breaks up in the end of our interview, and he obviously meant to say Russia. If you enjoyed this and you would like to get a transcript of these interviews every week delivered to you for free on a Friday, you can sign up for those emails, transcripts, and a link to our video each week by following the link in the description below. And please do me a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps us out a lot. I'm Ed D'Agostino. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.